radical reciprocity is, I think, a productive provocation for ethnography, and it's certainly something that ethnographers have been thinking about for a while. So, and yet, amidst all this agency and pleasure I'm talking about, it's often filled, our gaming, is often filled with hard work and failure. As a player, time in a game is spent just as often scratching my head at what went wrong and trying to sort it out. Sometimes I wander the world dead. Sometimes I can't find the help I need to finish something. Sometimes I realize a goal is actually out of reach, either due to my lack of skills or access. You often hear people wonder if computer games will ever reach a level of sophistication to make a player cry like movies can. And in my experience, if you still wonder about that, you've likely never talked to an MMO player. I've not yet cried so much yet at the dire state of something in the game, but I have certainly felt anger, frustration, racing heart, helplessness, and failure. Of course, in games, failure is a crucial component of learning and perfecting one's play. Our frustration at either our own skills or the game can push us to mastery, often like nothing else can. But play can be painful, and quite a few players log off in frustration and anger. And in fact, in game culture, the term of rage quitting, in which often a controller is thrown across the room, is a common notion. Ethnography, likewise, can be riddled with our failures, frustrations, and missteps. And I think we don't talk about this enough. I've often said I wished when I was a PhD student, my supervisors had spoke to me more of what failure looked like in the field and how to negotiate that. Over time, we become good, of course, at turning these moments around and making them part of our stories. And indeed, they're productive, just like in games. They can highlight for us the gaps between what we think and what actually is, what we aspire to have insight into and what we're seemingly utterly locked out of. Our failures and moments where we don't understand something or are frustrated can push us into areas we might not have explored otherwise. Such moments, I think, are a powerful counterbalance to the joy we can experience in the field. Sometimes we misspeak with our informants. We miss an opportunity we later kick ourselves over. Our recorder runs out of power, and we've left our extra batteries at home. We misread an event or practice. Sometimes we struggle with our own insecurities and the desire to know but not be terribly exposed ourselves. We feel conflicted sometimes in our enthusiasm for a field site, or struggle with our own distaste or even anger at things we encounter there. Especially in the early stages of ethnographic work, we live in, I think, a kind of double state, one of constant discovery, but often shaded by this struggle to catch a break, find a good confidant, gain access, or get some crucial interpretive handles on which to make sense of something. As we explore games, we often find ourselves bumping against their edges or limitations, sometimes finding a tactic that seems almost too good to be true. In the MMO world, those of you who play these games, you can think, for example, about pathing bugs that let the monster take longer to get to you than it takes for your damaging spells to get to it, and thereby you get a little bit of advantage. Sometimes we find a sweet spot in a game that we can stand in. We may consult guides that lead us through exact explanations of how to carry out a quest or kill something, thereby bypassing all that lovely exploration, discovery, and failure the developers intended. In some games, we can install additional software that helps with our play. Sometimes it's a UI mod that gives additional information or helps us with the tasks. Sometimes there's even third-party programs that will completely automate some aspect of our play or give us information the developers didn't want us to have. When we start adding in software bits, our play is often radically transformed, and we can find ourselves experiencing the game world quite differently from others who don't share our configurations. In all of the cases, we end up making decisions about what we think constitutes an ethical boundary line between fair play and cheating. Game developers have their own stances on this. Very often, groups themselves have their own opinions. Even particular guilds will have differing ideas about what counts as an exploit, what will get you kicked out of a guild or a group. Ultimately, our time playing in a game is one where exploration leads to moments of transgression, or at the minimum, decision points where you decide how far you're going to go. The choices we make about how we proceed, as well as the ways we directly intervene in the game itself, for example, modding the UI, can powerfully transform the game and play experience for us. So as ethnographers, are we engaged in transgression? How about transformation? At a very basic level, the activity we undertake is deeply informed by constantly living, I think, right on the edge of boundaries or limits. We can often seem odd or curious to our informants. Even if they're supportive of our work, they may find it strange that we're interested in all these mundane details and things they would never give a second thought to. In many ways, our stance is quite unnatural. In fact, I think what sane person would subject themselves to this outsider experience and repeatedly over the course of an academic life? We push our everyday experience to a level of analysis and critique it might not otherwise undergo. We may find ourselves having to interrogate our own pleasures and struggling with how that activity, in fact, of interrogation may transform them. We can unwittingly, as ethnographers, break rules or norms, and then, rather than simply doing that quick repair, spend time trying to understand and unpack the meaning of the transgression. We also do strange things that may be quite foreign to the natural state of our field site: collecting, logging, documenting, archiving, scribbling notes. Often our observations lead us to explore the boundary spaces and the lines between the legitimate and the transgressive that a group draws. Understanding, in fact, the nature of transgression in a space can be incredibly productive in making sense of it. But generally, any transgression we provoke is a kind of soft transgression, a byproduct of the practice of ethnography. It's quite rare we consciously do something to shake things up, though we may find instances where, especially in virtual spaces, the playfulness of an environment seems to push us to that experimental boundary. And here again, we can turn back and think about the Myers case as a productive talking through point. What about the issue of transformation? I think it's almost too clear. Our presence undoubtedly alters what happens in the space, and it certainly shapes the data as it filters back to us. As we write things up, we shape stories, trying to tease out themes. We write histories and accounts that might not have existed otherwise. And sometimes those back in the community may find themselves wrestling with, dealing with our interpretations and accounts of them. Our stories also shape future researchers as they enter into similar spaces, influencing what they look for or see or investigate. Ultimately, our stories present back to a larger culture an interpretation of our field site, and thus become part of a broader conversation. But there is, I think, another side to the transformation question, and that's how we're changed by our own work. Perhaps we find our values clarified or strongly challenged, or we find a new side of life to enjoy. Perhaps we learn about some personal strength we didn't realize we had, or just as often confront our own flaws. We rarely come away from a field site unchanged, and indeed, it may say something about the quality of the work if that was to happen. Transformation is, I would argue, an inherent part of ethnography. So for all this exploration, discovery, and analysis, our gaming life is still filled with stories handed down, unverified but widely believed, lore about how something works. Players often theorize causal relations in imaginative but regularly unverifiable ways. And whether we believe them or not, we sometimes find ourselves adopting practices that embody these myths. There may also be significant parts of an MMO world that we never see, never get access to, never even understand in terms of the mechanics or processes. While our game experience is consumed by a constant adding to our compendium of knowledge, it's in most cases always incomplete. I think this is also certainly the case with ethnography. And if we don't talk about failure enough, this may actually be another area where we don't talk about it enough, the unknowable in our work. Despite all our hard work, discovery, failure, success, understanding, and interpretation, there always remain nooks that are outside of our reach. The world often resists the systemization we seek. We're sometimes left with myths from the field, unable to track down final answers or lines of causation. During our research, we may know that there are pockets we simply will never gain access to or get glimpses of. Just as often, we see in retrospect an angle that we then kick ourselves over not capturing. While the guiding ethic of trying to pay due to all aspects of our field may loom large in our practice, in the end, we are always left with a degree of incompleteness. Leaving. At some point, we find ourselves drifting away from a game, or at least wanting to. Sometimes social ties keep us there long after our desire to play has left. We no longer have moments of discovery or learning. We take less pleasure in our mastery of a space. Things just seem to get old, and perhaps a bit boring or routine. Sometimes we set aside a game, but pop back in to play it once in a while, kind of checking in. In MMOs, we often taper off, but we may stop playing, but still read our favorite forum or website, checking in with our guild. Eventually trailing off, though, in how frequently we even read those too. If we're really invested in a game, we may archive the experience somehow, keeping a saved play file, having screenshots, notes, perhaps even maintaining an account so we don't lose a character. I often joke about how it's only really within the last year I finally let one of my characters from EverQuest go, and it was no small thing to sort of let that go. In ethnography, if there are not outside constraints, finances requiring us to return home, work obligations, we can stage through our departure gradually. We may begin to see patterns repeat. We know and anticipate practices and meanings. We may have a feeling of, in sociology we use the term saturation. Our sense of discovery becomes replaced with deep familiarity. We begin to sense that our leaving's around the corner and tie up loose ends. Once gone, we may still check in with our field site, following them when and how we can, and of course the internet and being online has made this very possible. Perhaps we've collected artifacts, objects from our time there that anchor our memories in it, that act as a kind of save file, if you will, aside the formal work of writing we do. But ultimately, we do leave. So in conclusion, for me, the comparison of the two domains yields some interesting overlaps and a few divergent points, ones which I think can prompt some interesting and deeper conversations, as in the case of responsibility or ethics. There are a couple final points I think worth making about what the two domains share, though. Each is constituted by what I would call assemblage work. It's highly reliant on a web of diverse actors, human and non, practices, and sometimes contentious meetings. There's no easy whole that we capture, but instead insert ourselves into a complex circuit of actions, agents, and structures. And in both play and ethnography, we must accept that there are always unanticipated consequences. Sometimes these turn out to be delightful moments and possibilities for discovery. Other times they carry heavier ramifications and meanings. But in both realms, it's never a static field, but a dynamic and emergent space of possibility. Okay, thanks.